Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. So as you mentioned, I'm Preet Kaur Gill. I'm the Labour and Co-op Member of Parliament in the UK, and I'm also Labour's Shadow International Development Secretary. And whilst it's a real pleasure to have been invited to speak to you here today, I want to really extend my thanks in particular to Republican David Baladeo. I hope I've pronounced his surname properly, but also your Democratic representative as well, Carlos Villapudua. I hope that, again, that's correct. I know that you both have been great advocates on some of the issues that we're going to be talking about today, especially the Kisan farmers' protests. And I'd actually like to touch briefly on that today, and of course on the case of Jagtar Singh Johal, which many of you will have heard of, who was obviously detained in India and still remains there today. For me, and I expect for many others on this call, the deteriorating human rights and freedom situation in India is very, very personal. And I say this as the first Sikh woman to be elected in the United Kingdom as a Member of Parliament, whose father moved to England just at the age of 15 and came from a family of the farmers in the Punjab. And we all still have family there now. And I know that is the situation for many US Sikhs and Canadian Sikhs and Sikhs in other parts of the world. But since September last year, when the Indian government introduced 3 new laws to deregulate India's vast agriculture sector, we have seen one of the largest protests in human history. 4 out of 10 Indians work as farmers, and agriculture more widely employs half of the country. So literally, in a country of 1.3 billion people, this issue directly affects quite literally hundreds of millions of people and their families around the world. And we have all seen the images of farmers in their tens of thousands marching from their homesteads in the Indian capital to peacefully protest against these laws. And 8 months on, they are still there, showing that sense of resilience and fighting for the very justice that they deserve. The incredible images of Sikh women making a sea of orange, sitting in protest in the camps in India is just quite remarkable. And the Farmers' Parliament, which gathered in recent weeks as well. It's now 8 months, as I said, these protests began. And in January, the government and the farmers completed an 11th round of talks without any resolution, with the ensuing protests and strikes dubbed as some of the largest in history. Some of the violence, though, that we saw in response in the first few months was truly shocking. And I think we've all seen reports and footage of the police brutality used against peaceful protesters in New Delhi, the water cannons and tear gas used to disperse crowds, and alarming footage of state police beating elderly farmers with batons. The Associated Press has also reported on the escalation in the use of silencing tactics by the Indian authorities, which have included detaining journalists and freezing social media accounts. Several journalists were charged under sedition laws for covering the protests, and we saw the internet blackout, which was ordered in New Delhi at one point, and activists being arrested for posting support for the protests on social media. This past year, during the pandemic, under the pretext of COVID-19, we've seen an alarming rise in the use of restrictions, which even inhibit or even outlaw peaceful association around the world. And as the science around the threat of this virus in outdoor spaces has become clear, attempts to curb freedoms to peacefully protest and organize have really been exposed for what they are. We've seen it in the UK ourselves, but also sadly in countries like India, which have gone backwards on their rankings as a democracy by 23% in just 7 years, if we are to accept the findings of the recent Freedom in the World report. I think this has been a wake-up call for a lot of people. And in a positive move last year was also the first time that regional bodies and the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Assembly and Association issued a joint declaration on the right to freedom of a peaceful assembly and democratic governance. This clearly outlines that states must pursue an approach based upon the principle that freedom of peaceful assembly is a fundamental human right. That doesn't just mean that freedom must be protected, but it means it has to be actively promoted, that states have a role to play in proactively encouraging freedom of peaceful assembly, allowing individuals to express their views, and brokering constructive civil engagement. This is not only an important right for its own sake, but it's also a fundamental tenet by which governments can make better policies and better laws. Listening to people and working with them to shape the decisions which impact them is the greatest duty of any government, not least during a crisis as great as the coronavirus pandemic. Indeed, the test of any democracy is the way those in power react to dissent. Recently, I've been thinking a lot about protests throughout history and my own heritage in relation to this. It has led me to think a lot about one of my heroes, Sophia Dalip Singh, the granddaughter of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, the ruler of the Sikh Empire from 1801 to 1839, and the goddaughter of Queen Victoria, a fact not many know about, but she was also a star in the suffragette movement, campaigning for women to have the right to vote in Britain and abroad. And today her name and picture are on the plinth on the statue of Millicent Fawcett in Parliament Square. The challenge that women like Sophia and other suffragettes put to their government of their day has literally changed the world. Whether it was Sophia's refusal to be counted in the census of a country in which she was denied a democratic say, or pounding the streets with copies of Votes for Women in hand, we all owe something to those people throughout history, like Sophia, who refused to keep their heads down or stay in their box. She would have defended our right to protest. And on Black Friday in 1910, she marched alongside Emmeline Pankhurst to Parliament to demand the right to vote, where she was kettled by the police. For 5 hours, suffragettes were penned into St. Stephen's Gate and beaten and thrown to the ground by police officers for demanding their right to a democratic say. Sophia was not cowed, however. Seeing one officer beating a woman amongst the crowd, this Sikh princess ran over to confront the officer beating this woman, yelling at him to stop. And so stunned was he by this tiny lady that he ran away, and Sophia chased him down the street until she got hold of his badge number. And the photographs from this shocking event of policemen in their uniforms looming over the beaten bodies of women outside of the Houses of Parliament haunted the government of its day and were the beginning of a change in public attitudes towards the suffragettes and their struggle. And in a few years' time, they finally succeeded in their historic campaign. So it's a reminder to governments that heavy-handed tactics are not only wrong, they are often ultimately self-defeating. 100 years on, I see the same courage of heroes like Sophia Dalip Singh in some of those activists standing up for the farmers now, and how the eyes of the world have turned onto what has been happening in New Delhi in a way that we've not really seen in the last decades. Social movements as great as the farmers' protest will not simply be silenced. We know how powerful and important protest is and can be, and that's why it's good that we can meet like this today to show that we won't turn our backs at home or abroad. Bula Chukandi Kema, Vai Gurji Ka Khalsa, Vai Gurji Ki Fateh.